begin by, by introducing myself. I'm Adam Rabinowitz. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Classics at UT. I'm an archaeologist who specializes in the Greek colonial world. But I'm also one of the founding members of the theme organizing committee for the Planet Texas 2050 Grand Challenge, and the current faculty chair of that committee. So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how the work that I do in the past relates to the work that our Grand Challenge is trying to do in the present, which really focuses on an attempt to ensure that Texas is habitable and sustainable and equitable by the time we get to the middle of the century, at which point the state demographer says we'll have nearly twice as many people, and the climate projections say that we will have a lot less water in the place where all those people are going to be, in the urban corridor that runs from Dallas to San Antonio, and a lot more water in inadvertent in moments when it is not necessarily wanted in places like Houston. So we're trying to approach this problem from a number of perspectives, and one of those is from the perspective of the past. I want to begin this session with UT's land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Cushata, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. And I was just at the conference of the Society for American Archaeology, where one of the speakers began with a land acknowledgement and immediately followed by acknowledging that land acknowledgements themselves are the subject of some controversy, especially as absolutions without action, where you say, well, I said the land acknowledgement, so now we're all fine. In this particular case, I wanted to call our attention to this issue of the stories of people who have inhabited the places where we are now living in the past, not only the distant, but also the recent. And that is really more or less the theme of this discussion. To frame it for the panelists and for the audience, this is the fourth in a series of roundtable panels that engage with the climate equity plan that the city of Austin has recently produced. And this is a plan that's meant to guide development and policy in the city in response to the recognition that climate change affects different communities differently and has a greater impact in many cases on communities that already are disadvantaged in various ways, socioeconomically or in terms of racial bias. And what I think is important to note is that the climate equity plan itself begins with a recognition of the historical inequities in Austin. And there are, I think, 2 points that I'd like to make to that effect. One is that Austin has a very pronounced history of segregation as a matter of deliberate policy, redlining and formal and informal barriers, which have pushed the Black community and the Hispanic community historically to the east side of town. And the other thing is that it is now undergoing a massive process of gentrification, which itself focuses on the east side of town. So those communities are being pushed even further away. I think we are one of the only, if not the only, major urban areas in the US that is losing Black population from year to year, as people can no longer live in those areas where they were forced to live between the 20s and the 70s or 80s. So those are pieces of Austin's historical environment, and the climate equity plan does address both of those as factors in its planning, and it also includes a reference to the preservation of culture and heritage as part of the equity planning process. And so while the roundtables that we've had so far have engaged with the city about its plans for the present and for the future, we're going to think about how those plans are relevant to the past, how the issue of Austin's history comes up, and how storytelling has a role to play in figuring out climate equity and in communicating some of these historical moments at a time when many cities are rapidly losing their past to new development. So what I'd like to do is to have a panel discussion. I've shared a few questions with each of the speakers, and we'll start with a couple of those and see where they take us, but we also want to leave time for the folks who are participating by Zoom and who are in the room to engage in this conversation as well. And I'd like it to be fairly informal. And if people do have questions or would like to intervene, please, among the panelists and among the attendees as well, just say so. So we'll begin with some brief introductions. And after each introduction, I'll ask the panelists to talk about the first question that I shared, which has to do with the way climate equity figures into that panelist's work. And we'll go in alphabetical order. So George, I will begin with you. George Belliveau is a professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia, and I believe the head of the department. He focuses on research-based theater and has published a great body of work in the areas of theater and drama education and arts-based research. He has a recent co-edited book called Contact Unload, Military Veterans, Trauma, and Research-Based Theater from UBC Press. And he leads the Research-Based Theater Lab at UBC, which is an interdisciplinary research excellence cluster sponsored by the Vice President Research Office. He's also a professionally trained actor and has participated in more than 100, it looks like, theater productions as an actor, director, or playwright. So George, if I could just ask you to comment briefly on your work and how you engage with issues of memory, history, and or cultural preservation, and how climate equity might figure into that.
Sure. So thanks for the introduction, Adam, and hello to everyone in the room and on Zoom. I want to acknowledge that I'm on the Coast Salish Musqueam lands, which are the ancestral territories of the indigenous people here where I live, currently in Vancouver, though home for me is on the east coast of Canada, which is in a province called New Brunswick, and my village is called Memramcook, where I grew up and my 50 cousins and all my relatives live, and Memramcook is on Mi'kmaq territory. And so I will speak maybe briefly later on around New Brunswick and the Acadian people, which is my heritage, who were cousins to the Mi'kmaq people. So as Adam introduced, the work I do is highly interdisciplinary at UBC, the research-based theater lab, which there's a couple of people in the room in Austin who are key members of the lab, Christina and Tetsuro, and they're in the space. Katie is graciously hosting them there, Katie Dawson. The lab really is, we're a vehicle to work in collaboration with other researchers who might have interesting data that they'd like to mobilize by using theater. And sometimes we work with them in collecting data, analyzing data, and then potentially performing the data. So in essence, the Research Theater Lab has worked with colleagues from both the university, but also from community. A number of the projects are related to climate equity, although not directly, and the lab is not experts in climate, though we facilitate the work that the researchers bring. I will speak a little bit later on through some of the questions about one of the projects on water. Adam alluded to water being an issue in Texas. It's certainly, as vast as Canada is, we still have severe issues of water advisories, and especially small communities, rural communities, and Indigenous communities. And one of our projects recently was looking at bringing water equity in some of these communities. And I'll speak to that project called Treading Water in a little bit. So I'll hand it on to the next person.
Thank you, George. Next, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Chenoweth, who is with us in person. Jennifer is a visual artist with a background in the arts and the humanities. She makes a variety of artworks, including online displays, and she actually made something called the XYZ Atlas which maps how we experience belonging, which you can find out more about in her TED Talk, which I believe is online. And Jennifer is also the creative spirit behind the Oakwood Chapel project, which takes a historic chapel in Austin's Oakwood Cemetery and the largely anonymous burial ground around it, and has built a really interesting public outreach program that extends from bioarchaeology and archaeogenetics all the way to historical research and the engagement of descendant communities. And it is I've been to some of the events there. It is a very impressive project. So Jennifer, could you talk a little bit about your work and how it connects to climate equity?
Sure. My background is in really the philosophy and art, and I've been grateful to be blessed with kind of a fearless spirit that is not afraid to get in trouble. And somehow the city of Austin hired me, which is amazing. So what I run is now basically a digital history museum on the grounds of a historic cemetery. And the cemetery was founded by all the colonial settlers migrating into Texas for the purpose of colonial plantation cotton. We have a lot of work to do as a site of conscience and accountability for the city of Austin for how our citizens of all types were treated. And that is an equity issue, which includes climate and how people migrate from one place to the other for the purpose of opportunity. And it also, our economic equity, our social equity is really a big deal there. So fortunately, I had worked as a public artist with the Parks and Recreation Department and was actually somewhat recruited for this job because they knew what they were getting. And so I would like, as the state of Texas teaches history written by politicians and not by historians, would like you to encourage you to go read our fall digital exhibit called To Relate, which was an Indigenous history project authored by my employee, Amy Heath, who's a member of the Caddo Nation. And she was researching her own heritage in geography and history. And it blew my mind to learn about our previous neighbors who many of them are still here. So that's what we do, is we research the who and the why and the concept of space and time in Austin in context of the world, and try and be accountable for the past and sit in the difficult history and try to earn the trust of the descendants of the marginalized communities who are buried in our cemetery.
Thank you. And I'm really impressed with this effort, in part because I've lived in Austin for nearly 20 years, and my general impression is that it is always in the process of trying to erase its own memory. So having something that actually holds on to those pieces of the past is really important, especially as we become another sort of Silicon area where all focus is on the future and none on where we've been. I'd like to introduce Edward González-Tennant, Ed, who is an archaeologist. We met on a panel we were both on at the AIA, and I was incredibly impressed with Ed's talk as well. He earned his PhD in 2011 from the University of Florida. And his research focuses on the application of digital technologies in archaeology and history, which is a subject close to my own heart. But beyond that, he also has an incredibly vibrant program of public engagement through those technologies and projects that focus, among other things, on the Rosewood community in Florida, the site of a very tragic massacre in the 20s or the 30s. And I'm sorry,
23.
23. And in commemorating that and bringing back to the public eye sites associated with that community, not just in that time of tragedy, but also as part of its life as a vibrant community. And also has worked on archaeology in the Caribbean and decolonization, and on the effects of climate change and sea level rise and storm surge on coastal archaeological sites. So there's probably already some evidence about how Ed's work engages with both equity and the climate. But Ed, could you speak a little bit about what you do and how it relates to these themes?
Absolutely. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if that works. Can you see a PowerPoint slide?
We can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be quick. I have a few slides here. Thanks for having me. You'll see the UTRGV logo here. I'm happy to announce I'll be joining the anthropology department there this fall. But so my research, so I'll be in Texas. So that will make things cool. But
Operations at Planet Texas with UTRGV. So look for us. We'll be in touch.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to briefly talk about my research and interest in these topics very briefly, right? So this all started over 15 years ago, and I started doing work in Rosewood, particularly trying to reconstruct the spatial layout of the community. It's unincorporated. There's no historic plats. So this answers descendant questions from the beginning, right? Where was my grandfather's house located beyond over there in Levy County, right? That in turn drove a bunch of traditional archaeological work. We've now done excavations, field surveys, ground penetrating radar surveys, cemetery mapping projects at about a dozen projects. For those of us who are archaeologists, this is really a monumental achievement because all of these are privately owned. So to create that rapport necessary with those landowners for this sustainable engaged project has been a lot of work. This work in turn drives a bunch of public outreach, right? So everything from public talks to oral histories used for digital storytelling. You can also see spinning around in the slide 3D reconstructions of various sites, such as the Rosewood Cemetery. This would be a black burial ground that is today still on private property. So this is one way to share that site with a larger audience. This, of course, alerted folks in the area to my interests, which eventually led to me being elected as president of the Cedar Key Historical Society. And you can see this is about 10 miles from Rosewood. Cedar Key is the only incorporated town in that part of Levy County that survives. This historical society and its museum are both the oldest and largest and longest running museum and historical society in a 5-county area. And so simultaneously with this sort of public outreach, right, my own research looks at storm surge, sea level rise, and how this can impact things like, for instance, here, historical cemeteries, so that researchers, citizens, various agencies can prioritize their documentation and preservation efforts. And on the right-hand side, this actually gets incorporated in my courses like disaster anthropology, where students get to actually engage, sort of firsthand interact with computer mapping and interactive mapping and these data. In fact, in the Cedar Keys, there's been enormous change to the local landscapes. This animation here shows a small island that today is uninhabited. It's a wildlife preserve. It's called Etseniote. But this is where Cedar Key gets its start, really. First as a military hospital during the Second Seminole War, then as an industrial center, which is eventually abandoned in 1896 after a hurricane. And then since the 1970s, something like 5% of the land of that island has gone away because of increasing storm surge, increasing hurricane activity, and sea level rise, all of which, right, is really ramping up in terms of pace over the last 50 years. There's a whole African-American heritage component in Cedar Key that was relatively unknown. For instance, here's an image of the cemetery. There is an area that's roped off with unmarked graves. There's one grave back there, this concrete marker, which we had to photo scan to read, so do a 3D model of. It's an African-American woman who worked in the community and died years after the Rosewood Massacre in 1923. I, like other researchers, assumed that massacre preceded a population exodus of African Americans in the area, but in Cedar Key, in fact, this population continues until at least the 50s. So now that cemetery is part of additional research being driven by the community. The Historical Society has gotten the funding for this. we're doing computer mapping, cemetery mapping, ground penetrating radar survey. And of course, this cemetery is located in an area threatened by sea level rise and storm surge. And so all of these projects combined with additional public education outreach, like virtual reconstructions of Cedar Key circa 1920, complete with a virtual simulation of what a Category 3 hurricane storm surge looks like and how it impacts this historic community. And ultimately, right, this is sort of like a personal note, this has driven additional outputs, right? There's now a large African-American museum history exhibit in the museum with an interactive component. As I stepped off the board, we were able to sort of celebrate the society's 50+ year history, its first Black members, but also its first African-American board member. So I'll stop sharing now. And I tried to rush through that. I want to keep it short, but also give you like a picture of how I see these things sort of coming together and supporting engagements with really multiple communities.
Thanks, Ed. It's always it's so much stuff. I was totally intimidated by the talk at the AIA. I was like, oh, man, everything. And finally, I would like to introduce Mónica Teresa Ortiz, who is one of Planet Texas 2050's artists in residence, and who is a Texan poet and writer, who also, I think, has, are you currently a resident or recently a resident journalist with the Freedom Ways Reporting Project? That's another current position, and also a Texas Folklife Community Fellow. And Mónica has published poetry in a number of different outlets, including a forthcoming poetry in Hayden's Ferry Review, and also runs workshops to capture writing from various communities in Texas. And we are hoping that this is part of the set of projects that they will do for the residency with Planet Texas 2050 in the context of capturing stories from the broader population. And I know a little bit from Mónica's own documentary work about their growing up in the Panhandle and the connection with both climate and pollution and industry and communities. So I wanted to ask you, Mónica, if you would comment a little bit on storytelling and history and climate equity in your own work.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Mónica, and I am unfortunately not there in Austin today, but I am here in the Panhandle, which are the lands that were stolen from the Comanche and Humano people. And, I started doing this project kind of late last year. And it kind of, I'm a poet by craft, by training, and sort of using that framework of coming from that background to work on this project for Planet Texas, hopefully involving different communities that are facing various climate issues. I wanted to say that, I think for me, I sort of approached this work very similarly to another artist, Doris Salcedo, who talks a lot about this process of memory in the construction of her work. And, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So, for me, it's almost impossible to not think about our relationship to climate and especially to water in my case, because that's the main focus of my project. But, thinking about these pretty big disasters that happened during my childhood, like I can think of like Chernobyl, the Exxon Valdez spill, more recently, Deepwater Horizon, all of these very big impacts on on water and on land. And I think a lot about the way that I guess I sort of came to this work in particular. I'm from the Panhandle. If you're not familiar with it, it is home to cattle, cotton, to agriculture. And there's a lot of issues stemming from those industries in this area, but I went to school in Austin to UT, and I remember, this was like about 2001 when I was there. And there was a really big push from a community to shut down the Holly power plant, which was in East Austin. They had been there since I think the 60s or 50s. And a lot of residents had noticed that there had been increases in cancer, the noise levels from the plant. So sort of just like, witnessing how communities kind of face off against these larger corporations was really important, I think, to me also coming to this work. And, later I went on to grad school in El Paso, and in El Paso, there was also another community fight against the Asarco plant that was there, and it was built along the banks of the Rio Grande River, so it's kind of in between both Juarez and El Paso, and you could see it from UTEP, from almost anywhere you were at on campus, you could see the smokestack. And I've read that the smokestack was one of the largest in the country. And again, like, residents really had to come together and work to shut down that place because it was polluting not just the water, but people that were working there and people that lived in proximity. And I think, for me, it's part of this work is to, work with the communities who are facing these sort of pretty big issues.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do at this point is just to throw out some of the questions that I shared with all of you, and see where it goes. I'll just let anybody who would like to jump in, but I wanted to start with the question that I was rolling around as I was trying to figure out how to do a panel on the City of Austin climate equity plan that intersected with the stuff that I do, which is all about the past. And so that broad question is, what are the connections that you see between these questions of place and memory and history and the idea of climate equity, or a climate equity plan, a plan that's meant to mitigate the disproportionate impact of climate change on already marginalized communities? If anybody would like to jump in.
Maybe I'll jump in. First of all, it's great to hear from all the other panelists as well, and to kind of get a sense of where people are coming from. I alluded to the project of water issues across Canada and rural communities, and this is part of a large pan-Canadian, quite interdisciplinary, although it's led by engineers who are really tasked to bring water filtration systems in communities that they're either on boil water advisories, or there's just too many chemicals in the water that it's just not safe. So when we're talking about climate in relation to that project, there's many intersections. A lot of these communities have to fly in bottled water. They have to try to find way, because they're sometimes remote, so they can't go by vehicle. So you're talking about a lot of emissions that are taken up by airplanes, et cetera. But probably to answer Adam's question, or to respond to it, a lot of the reasons why these communities may not embrace the water systems that the engineers are bringing is about history. It is about memory. It is about past treatments of members of those communities. And they're not solely indigenous. Some of them are rural communities that have distrust for anything that's government or that is coming from outside. So the collaboration that I was fortunate enough to be part of, which, as I mentioned, was very interdisciplinary, was around how do we come together with community and engage to not necessarily build a water system that's adjacent to the cemetery, for instance, which to resonate with Jen's work. So to be respectful, to be mindful. And I'm not saying it's solving all the problems of water issues in Canada, but at least it's a step forward. The communication, it's really about engaging with community, understanding the cultural traditions of these unique territories. And the other thing I've discovered with this project is that we kind of put this blanket on Indigenous communities in Canada. They're all the same. Well, actually, they're all unique. They all have the unique languages, their unique cultures, etc. So I think long-term, some of these projects will benefit by this multidisciplinary approach. And to focus on what we do with the Research-Based Theater Lab is that we are listening to the stories of the engineers, the community members, and more particularly, we worked a lot with what is called the water operators. Those are the individuals who play with the gauges, are present when things aren't going well in the community. They are really the kind of the mediator of, because they understand the engineering, they understand the community. So their stories have been pivotal to us. And so the piece that we developed called Treading Water really focuses on the story or stories of these water operators who in some ways enable the process to work forward. So if we have time, I'll share a short monologue in a bit around a water operator and the impact the researchers had on the water operator, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to address this question?
I have to figure out my hotkeys. I mean, from my own work, I'm thinking particularly like ideas in disaster studies as that intersects heritage and archaeology, and the concept of like slow onset disaster. I mean, most disasters are actually slow onset disasters because we're concentrating vulnerability differentially across society. And so, like, as you already mentioned with Austin, many of the same communities where vulnerabilities are being concentrated through, development pressures, poverty, and obviously how that intersects other identities like race, even, right, those being conflated in many ways in the US. The same places where vulnerability to disaster and, climate equity needs to be focused on, these are the same areas whose histories and community or collective memories are, if they're not intentionally erased or obfuscated, at best, they're already hidden. And so I think the two concepts, it's sort of like if you do one, you're automatically primed to do the other because they're so intimately tied together. And that's something that for myself has become increasingly clear. We see these communities impacted by natural disasters. I mean, natural disasters, right? We know the social aspects of this. And so, when I think about this, I've increasingly been incapable of separating these things because, in reality, they're not separable.
Monica, do you have something to add?
Sorry, you've got to unmute yourself. It wouldn't be a Zoom call without a.
Oh yeah. Working on the project that I've been doing, I think, one important part of my work, I think, in like my approach is, kind of asking communities like what it is that they need, and not and trying not to make like assumptions, and also, you know, being able to hold space for their experiences, their lived experiences. You know, for one, like something that I'm starting to work on, for example, is there's a group in San Antonio, the Southwest Workers Union, and they're community-based, grassroots, and they got involved against the Kelly Air Force Base, who had been polluting one of the neighborhoods nearby. And they were able to kind of come together and, you know, shut down Kelly Air Force Base, basically. And so, you know, they've done all that. That's already, you know, there. And so for me, I wanted to know what is something I can do tangibly, you know, materially, to help. And for them, that looks like, you know, doing a workshop. It looks like helping them, you know, go through their archives. So I think that's one way, one approach, to sort of like tie together these ideas.
I'm always interested in what is allowed to be remembered, as you referenced earlier, what is preserved, what is researched, and then what is taught in education. And that is our access to memory, if it's not just a personal, familial one. And so how we create a shared repository of memory of place, because all cities and all places change over time, but how we share that repository has become very political. And that's either due to the opportunity for profit for some group, or the need to avoid shame, or both. And those two things seem to be this major factor that has really created this enormous division of what we can and cannot safely talk about. And it has become, people are so personalize it so much that they can't sit in the difficult conversations with each other, or even within themselves, to create what is an acknowledged shared experience of place. You can be in a place and just feel that something happened here. It's in our animal self. Even though our air is more viscous than water, we are in this big fish tank right here together. And we may not have the same experience, but we may have the same intuition or connection to place. And that, to me, is how we really need to think about what memories are preserved and how, and to really notice that it's that profit or shame thing that seems so hard to, like, they're like a pinball thing. They're just gonna bat the cumulative memory away. So not terribly eloquent, but that's my response to your question.
Well, and a lot of these responses also had to do with communities and who you're talking to, and this sense of community. And so I'm going to jump to another question. Monica, I wonder if you could start, just because it builds on something that you were saying about how you work with communities by beginning with asking them what it is that they need. And I'm curious in general about how all of you have identified the communities that you want to work with, and how those approaches have happened, and what has been successful or unsuccessful in engaging with different communities or stakeholders. It's something that we've made a priority for Planet Texas as a whole, but that has been of different levels of difficulty for different sub-projects, depending on how much familiarity they have with it. And I have to say that one of the things that classical archaeologists who work in the old world are not particularly good at is finding communities and stakeholders in their own environments and working with those groups. So I'd really like to know, Monica, starting with you, how you've chosen communities to work with, how those relationships have evolved, what has worked and what hasn't worked in building those connections that allow you to address the needs that are expressed to you.
Yeah, so a little bit of about my project for Planet Texas kind of started with this bigger question about water in Texas and our relationship to water. As I mentioned, I grew up in the Panhandle. It's pretty dry here. It's, part of the Great Plains. We don't have, a lot of water. The closest river, I think, is the Canadian or the Brazos. And those are at varying levels of, of being dried out. The Red River runs through Paladro Canyon, but it's been dry. I used to go there as a kid. It was always dry. There was hardly ever any water. So, for me, that's kind of where my project stemmed from, was just thinking about what is our relationship to water and what does that look like in a place as big as Texas, where people's relationship to water is so different, because then you go to Houston and, they're hit by hurricanes, and you go to South Texas, which a lot of South Texas are in floodplains. So they also deal with a lot of flooding, so there's just different, relationships based, geographically. And I think for me, part of my approach to that is establishing my own relationships to, not just to water, but to different communities, and those usually come through my own personal relationships. So for example, the Southwest Workers Union, I'm not from San Antonio. I've been a couple of times, but that sort of relationship came because of another friendship that I have. And, was sort of invited into that community. And I'm working to do something in Houston. It's very similar in that case, of trying to reach out and build personal relationships with communities who are there, who are doing this kind of work, and asking them what resources can I provide, what can I do to assist you in. And then that goes back to being here in the Panhandle. My project for Texas Folk Life also revolves around this particular community, which is where I've grown up. And, reaching out to, my neighbors, people that also grew up here, and just, creating a dialogue, a conversation, and asking them what is your relationship to water and to land?
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on this idea of how you ended up working with the communities that you're working on, or that you're working with? Because I think that what Monica said about friendship and personal connection is really important, but also hard if you don't already have a personal connection or a friendship that provides the foundation of trust to build from.
I have a pretty long history of community engagement, and it often starts with just being generous, showing up with something to offer instead of expecting to just receive, or I need this thing, or we need this research, which we as researchers or whatever will profit off of, or keep our jobs or whatever it is.
Right.
But to actually expect to be told loudly no 3 times. Pick somebody who'd be the hardest person to approach and expect to be completely ignored, then told no 3 times. Then if you could get them to show up, they yell at you or stone face you. What would it take for you to stay engaged until you could ask them a question that they'd be willing to answer? And then what would it take to stay engaged with them to actually create the most tenuous bonds of trust, to just attempt to try? How much showing up does it take? It takes a lot of time. And it takes agreeing to the terms of engagement over, I have done this in art events, over domino games, or being of service, literally standing there cooking food for people. Or if it's in a more formal setting, I always offer an honorarium to anyone I'm asking. I try and engage, tell them who referred me to them. I didn't just find you on the internet and I'm just here to bug you. But to really, it takes time. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of humility and really low expectations of what you're going to get out of it, and a lot more about what you could possibly offer that this person might want.
That makes a lot of sense.
We do the research on family genealogy that's just become digitized and share it with our African-American descendants so that when they come in, I'm like, oh, can I show you this thing? Who is your relative? Oh, can I show you this thing about your mother, who I just think was the most amazing person? That's your mother. And then they're like, okay, now I might talk to you because you know my people and you know where I'm from. And I can tell you that that takes hours and hours and hours of research before even daring to have that conversation in person and being present when you can. It's real, it takes a lot of vulnerability and trying to not take it personally, because there are so many things worse than just being called a racist. Right? That is a tiny little problem to have compared to what this other person may have experienced.
Right.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Just from an arts perspective, as a fellow arts person, I'm also just interested in how your visual art, sense making and meaning making process feeds, or maybe doesn't feed it. Maybe you're using that to then create, but I just wonder how that feeds into like the skills you have as an artist and as part of your communication or creating or making sense, how that becomes a tool in any of your practice or not.
Yes, I've done a lot of work where your participation is the thing,
Yeah.
because I could be alone with myself in my studio all day long, and I would have so much professional growth or crafts growth that I would not transform. So if you imagine a performing artist or someone in a theater, they have a live audience. If you have a musician, they have applause. The audience actually knows which are the best songs, which we now have the handy tools, right?
Yes.
The artist doesn't always know unless you're willing to engage in that way. And I ended up just discovering that my live audience was so much more interesting than me alone in my studio. That was a place I could survive but not thrive.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was not treating my audience. I looked at a lot of artists' websites where there were no people in the pictures. And I was like, who is this for then? I don't want to have replaced church with a white museum. I want to have the opportunity to grow, and I can only do that if you challenge me. Or tell me what I did that was cool that I did on a 10-minute whim. Like, oh, that worked. Let's figure out why. Or let's figure out what doesn't work or what I don't know. Which you can only consider if your audience is a collaborator or the stakeholder of the project. Not just the person we sort of got a cursory okay from to engage.
Can I actually also ask for elaboration?
Please.
And then it actually builds on Monica Ortiz's point about relationships, because I think, and at least two examples here, in that of González-Tennant and Ortiz's, we have a meaningful connection to place. And so positionality comes up, right? So without essentializing identity, I think positionality plays a very important part in how we think about a connection to place and how to build those relationships. And this is certainly a big question at a meta level theoretically, but it's shaping how we're thinking about our own team development, because we have to think very critically about maybe natural scientists that we start working with and who don't have experience, either formal educational training or personal experience working with historically marginalized communities. And that can create big tensions in how we think about project implementation. And so I think that the idea of positionality is very central to these discussions. And I say that to in appreciation of Monica Ortiz's comment about relationships that take place over time and where a person has a meaningful connection to place. And so actually, I appreciate hearing González-Tennant's comments or perspective on that as well, how that plays out, the risks involved in going back to the place where you're from, potential judgments that come with that in professional settings, et cetera.
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I would just like to echo everything else that I'm hearing, because I think, you know, the communities I'm working with in Levy County, and those aren't the only communities, right? But the sort of idea that, you know, I'm sitting here as a scholar at a university and prestigious and you know, and there's like with Rosewood and the families, the descendants were one community to work with. The landowners who are, you know, living on land that, you know, changed hands because of violence. And, you know, we could theorize this community as a perpetrator community. And I think that there's some value in that, right? But trying to walk the fine line of engaging these different communities meant that sometimes a lot of what I did is exactly what's already been said, just showing up and being present. You know, as an archaeologist, we have certain benefits and certain challenges, right? The public is naturally drawn to what we do, so we can utilize that. But if we're working in areas with contentious histories, right, I had to spend a lot of time building rapport and healing wounds caused by other researchers who came into these communities and quite frankly had no interest in actually working with these communities, but saw them as opportunities to drive their own career advancement, right? And so, you know, the tact I eventually ended up taking as a graduate student, right, in the 2000s, this was not, there wasn't a lot I could draw on as an archaeologist to sort of direct me. So I decided to just be like a genuine person and just tell people, look, these are the sorts of things I can do as an archaeologist. Is any of this useful to your community? And so a lot of the work I ended up exploring was not stuff I had originally planned to do, right? The virtual reconstructions of Rosewood, and then you see it now playing out with Cedar Key. I sort of flippantly suggested that as one way to keep the history alive for the next generation in a conversation with a group of Rosewood descendants. And I'm like, well, what if we did a virtual reconstruction? And they're like, that's great, do that. And so, you know, I committed myself inadvertently to years of learning how to do new things. But I also had, as a researcher, as a graduate student, I had the ability to do that. And I also feel that it was really important as an archaeologist to explore those methods, right? Because then we're starting to talk about representation of people's histories, that as collaboratively constructed as it is, there's somebody who takes a lead on building that. And I felt if I farmed that out to someone else or got, you know, people who are not engaged in that process the same way, right, to get 3D models or whatever, right? So I decided to learn all of that. So I think very much approaching people and shedding the disciplinary, hierarchical, egotistical, I'm the expert, all of those sorts of ideas that are omnipresent for generations of academics, if we're honest, shedding that posturing as much as you can is one of the primary ways that we are able to actually create these really, and the word I would use, right, long-term, I would use sustainable, right? If we're not showing that we're willing to be engaged for a long period of time, I mean, people pick up on that. I mean, that was my approach. And so with the Historical Society, you know, I could have ran those grants through the University of Central Florida. Central Florida would have taken their cut for doing, quite frankly, very little. Or I could help the communities develop that capacity locally, and they could take all of that. And so, we were able to, during COVID, raise just from grants alone over $100,000 to support those projects. And a lot of that money went directly into the community at a time when, it's a tourist town now, at a time when people were struggling to make rent. And those are concerns that for me were very real. I grew up poor in the Ozarks, right? First gen. Being able, to find a way to use heritage to help people feed their families and pay their mortgages or rents felt like a really important thing I could do, and not something that I think is centered enough in scholarly or academic discussions of these sorts of things. I hope that makes sense.
I'd like to jump in. There's 3 artists on the panel. Monica, Jen, and I identify as partly as our work. And this monologue here, I think, speaks to the idea of community. It's written from the researcher's perspective, and it's fairly short, but I think it resonates with what you've just been saying there and what Monica and Jen have said, I think, as well. So picture this long-term researcher, engineer, working in this small community at a community hall. So imagine we're in a community hall. So it's written from the researcher's perspective. So I'm taking questions at the community meeting, and then this one lady sticks up her hand, and I can tell that this won't go well. This woman, she says, those fancy degrees, and you people get it all wrong. I mean, this lady, she's angry. And really, frankly, that seems natural, because when you've had a boil water advisory for 12 years, you're going to be angry. I mean, the operators, the researchers, all of us. So this is the researcher speaking to the community. All of us, we have been doing the best we can with you with the resources that we have. The woman in the audience, she waves her hand and she cuts me off. I'm not mad as I used to be about the water. That's nothing new. I'm mad because there's no dialogue between the government and the community. I mean, you build these treatment systems, the big whoop, but you don't speak a word to us and you don't hear us. You refuse to hear what we really need. So as the researcher, I think, yeah, she's got a good point. So look, I understand that you're upset, but what this community really needs is clean water. And then the room goes quiet for a second. I think maybe I got through to her and to all of them. But then a smaller voice comes from the way back of the room, one of the community elders, and her voice just cuts through the room like ice. We just need you to listen. And then I realized that this whole time I've been trying to listen. I've been really trying to listen. I just didn't know how. But I have to start. I have to. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. So that's the end of that little piece. I'd like to acknowledge this was written by a collaborator, and a couple of people in the room were highly collaborative on this piece as well. And it's based on the research and the community suggestions. But hopefully it speaks to how art can also enable stories, which was one of Adam's questions as well. How does story come in to the work that we do?
Thank you, George. That really sort of captured a number of the things that we've been talking about. So at this point, I want to give an opportunity for both the people who are attending by Zoom and for the people in the room to ask questions. And I have a last question at the end, but for the moment, let's open it up to people here or on Zoom. Heidi, are you monitoring the chat? You could post a question in chat. You could raise your Zoom hand.
question for Monica, if none of you are putting your hands up just yet. Monica, what would be your ideal project? What would be a scenario where you as an artist would feel supported and seen? Where you would be like, that was what I had been going for and I didn't even know I needed. Or maybe knew, but didn't know how good it would feel once you got it.
Do you mean just like in general?
As an artist.
I mean, I think a lot of artists would love funding to just do their projects and be left alone. So I think that's my ideal situation.
Yeah, that is a fair answer. I think a lot of us feel the same way about projects as well. Like the best one is a funded one. So let me ask. I'll pose this question, and meanwhile, people can formulate or not as they see fit. But don't miss this opportunity. This is an unusually rich conversation and a really interesting group of people. So I'm wondering, as a person who is not a specialist in climate equity plans or climate equity in general, or city plans or urban policy or cities, I'm good at Greek archaeology, but I'm wondering, from all of your perspectives, the City of Austin Equity Plan, again, it addresses questions of historical inequity as a sort of a frame, and it includes the idea of cultural preservation without exactly defining what that means as one of the core values in the intersection of planning or racial equity and climate. And it has an equity tool that's associated with the evaluation of plans that other bodies are making about Austin that includes an evaluation of this issue of cultural preservation. What should the City of Austin be thinking about in making plans that are meant to govern development, or at least contribute to the way development happens in Austin, from the perspective of memory and history and storytelling and place? So given the fact that there is this climate equity plan, what should it include? What should be more specific than there should definitely be some kind of cultural preservation, and we should be paying attention to the needs of communities that are not only frontline on climate, but frontline on the loss of their own pasts as development proceeds in a city like Austin?
I know I talk too much, but sorry, there's more. So my idea is that we create a digital twin of historic Austin and take it back to when it was the 4 Sacred Springs and the El Camino Real de las Tejas Trail that was here because it was the economic and cultural trade route of all the indigenous people who were here, who came together for trade and social engagement. But it was physically here because of the 4 big springs that are now, if you look at a map, along the line I-35. That's why we are here in Central Texas. And at the same time, if you're wanting to talk about Planet Texas 2050, can someone more loudly acknowledge the modeling that has not to do with the next fanciest domain-like development, but the fact that we are number 4 on the national risk for wildfire damage to public property west of Austin? So how can we put in one place the digital modeling that is done in various places within UT? Edward's working on digital modeling for his preservation things. And what if we could preserve Monica's artwork in a digital format to be in our collective memory, to be displayed within this digital twin that has a time slider on it, right? So you're not just looking forward and maybe you can stop a bulldozer from knocking over something that might have needed to be preserved or at least researched before it is gone. And also, like look to the why we are all here together and what cultural assets we have and what cultural risks we will have and will continue to have as the climate changes due to our activity. So to me, it's not just looking just forward, but looking at time and place together. And if we could put all of our shared information together in one kind of digital twin resource, and not just in a forward-looking thing, but so that everyone, the developers, as well as an elderly person in their neighborhood, could see the whole picture together, and that be in a format that is accessible to all at a public library or on a computer or through your phone as you're in a place. Could you see the climate risks that are created by having such an expensive city that all of our necessary workers of color have to live an hour's drive away? What is that adding to this? How can that just that data measure inform our models of growth that is coming and how we have it? It's going to be the how we do it that comes from the where we have been and why we are here.
No, that's a really, it makes me think one of the projects that Planet Texas is supporting, one of the flagships, is focused on hazard modeling, with a focus on flooding, but also dealing with fire. And what Ed has been doing with coastal modeling, there's a similar set of questions that could be explored with the incorporation of historical place data and, you know, things that are still around that are threatened by that. But it is this issue of vision, right? That if you can't see it on a map, it doesn't exist anymore. And so having a way to be able to express some of those historical pieces that aren't immediately visible in our landscape and that don't appear on the maps that are being used by developers, I think that is an important issue. Just better spatial and temporal awareness for something like the climate equity plan.
Aren't you shocked when you experience your world and there's a new building there and you're shocked at the new building, but you can't remember what was there 3 months ago when you were last there?
I am constantly
Isn't that the
disturbed
weirdest
by that.
utopia?
Mhm. And you're like, was that the place that I used to do this, or was that not this is another feature of Austin that I cannot get used to. I come from a town in Massachusetts that is now about 1,000 people. And around the 1920s, it has a typical New England town common. But the typical New England town common was just a bunch of buildings of different colors and things like that. In the 1920s, the Town Historical Society said, no, we've got to make a typical New England town common. So everybody's house has to be white clapboard with green shingles. I mean, with green shutters and, you know, this kind of a chimney. And so they redid it, and now people go and they're like, oh, this is a typical New England town, even though it was sort of manufactured as one in the 20s after the factories left, because it was also a factory town. And then the factories went away and it was like, no, this is what we are. And just that sort of static nature, and it's artificial, but it hasn't changed since I was a kid. And in Austin, 20 minutes later, you go down and the restaurant that you were trying to buy food at doesn't exist anymore. And suddenly there's a condo there. So this issue of trying to keep track of what has been, I think is a big one. George or Ed, did either of you want to comment on that issue of what a climate equity plan should consider with respect to history and memory in a rapidly developing city?
Well, I very much like the idea. I put a link in the chat, some folks from Michigan Tech who are doing the Q&A Time Traveler. It's a two-dimensional version almost of what you were talking about. And I think that there's a lot, I love the idea, right? Like, I mean, finding a tool. And what's cool about that project is it's very much community driven, right? They're transcribing Sanborns, they're recording oral histories, they're doing genealogical work, and they're asking the community to help generate that data set. And so, yeah, I mean, there's no 3D component to that, although that would be a cool idea. It's one of these communities, though. This is the Copper Rust Belt. It's completely economically, a disaster zone now, right? These just incredibly impoverished communities that a century ago were some of the wealthiest in the Midwest. And so what happens, what's being lost, right? And there's different issues of disaster, climate, equity, race, class, and so forth happening there than say in Austin. But, you know, the method I think is sound. I mean, in terms of what a climate equity plan needs, I mean, I think those of us who go to these sorts of events where like you've got, it's going to sound weird, right? You've got a roundtable of scholars, right? Which we have a roundtable of more than that. So that's cool. But, you know, the experts who come to basically disseminate their expert knowledge. And it's an hour or two, you know, every 6 months. And the community buy-in. I mean, those are the sorts of things. I saw it in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy, because I was there teaching, and they had, you know, this, and they're even, you know, sort of billing this as like the community comes together to talk about what we can do to be more resilient. And there's basically nobody from any community there. It's agency representatives, it's scholars, it's people who didn't suffer. It's, you know, those voices aren't being represented, you know, the sort of classic top-down hierarchical approach that too much disaster response and planning takes. So that's definitely not what it needs. I guess I can say what it doesn't need. I mean, you know, a lot of what people are saying here, grassroots commemorative practices, finding out what matters to the people who live there, and then finding a method for making that actually heard. You know, in a town like Cedar Key, where there's a, you know, a year-round population of less than 1,000 people, it's a lot easier to create that that community input. Austin, you know, obviously you're going to have to, there's going to have to be, I think, a push to be very much neighborhood oriented, and, you know, not getting overly theoretical here, but, you know, trying to get away from that vertical power structure that's so common for these things, and really generating a much more horizontal power structure that, you know, brings people on their terms, at their pace, when they, you know. But if you can walk down the street and your favorite restaurant isn't there anymore, and instead, I don't know what's in its place, high capacity housing or something, apartment buildings, condos, you know, the pace there is so quick that everyday stuff like that's not happening. I mean, you guys know that. I don't know, I'm not there, but, you know, every day that's not happening is another community's history potentially irretrievably lost. And we have great digital tools to combat that now. We just have to find the willpower, I guess. And the funding.
Right. Mary, go ahead.
So I really appreciate the discussion on memory, and I'm fortunate to be on a project where we're working with youth of color and thinking about a potential green future. And we're engaging these ideas of greenwashing. So some of the problems associated with working toward greener cities. But the larger overall concept is the idea that young people of color can contribute meaningfully to what a decarbonized future might look like. And sometimes I worry that in the process of just focusing on the future, we're neglecting the past, right? And so my larger question is, how do you think about young people as potential collaborators? Have you engaged young people in your projects? And how do you think about young people in relation to memory, given their age? Because the most engaged projects that I've learned about on this topic engage our elders, engage people for multiple generations. And so I'm just wondering about the role of young people and how you think about this work.
I'm just going to make a quick comment about your question, and then I've asked Monica if she would share a poem, as this would be very fitting to hear some of the work, and I think she has agreed to do so. So that'll be great. It's interesting. I just responded to an email this morning of a class, a grade 6 class that wants to do a project on climate change, or the other word that they use is energy usage. And I think there's an appetite for youth to be thinking about climate change, but I think your question around memory is a little more, I think, complex, because you're right, what are they drawing from? So I really like that question. Monica, can I indulge you to share a poem with us.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment in response to that question, because I do think it's a really important thing to think about. And I think, for climate justice, we really have to be thinking intergenerationally. It is crucial to talk to our elders, but it's also equally important to make sure that younger generation is involved, because this is the world that they're receiving. And I think it's again like about building those relationships between communities, between generations, and not feeding into, I think capitalism really promotes isolation and individualism. And I think one way to combat that is to create a more collective engagement from, not just the future, but also the past and the present, which includes young people and people that are, in between that, and as well as, our elders. So thank you for asking. I think that's important work. And yeah, I guess I can share. So I've been working on a book, and April is National Poetry Month. So I was challenged by an editor to write a poem every day for this month, which has been difficult sometimes, but I've managed to do it. So I'll share one of that. And my work is greatly influenced by these different intersections. So okay, so real quick, I'll just read a short poem. It's called Mouth. Why does a shark eat a songbird? The obvious answer is hunger. Feathers of a brown thrasher scattered, vomited onto the deck of a boat. Reverse hunger. From the belly of a tiger shark caught off the coast near Mississippi. I wonder what hunger disorients you, songbird, without knowing the route towards heaven. Jawbone witnesses hunger, whose wings will fail during flight and thrust you into the frenzy of hungry waters.
Thank you. So I think that's a great note to start wrapping up on, but I do want to give all of the panelists a chance to say anything that they wanted to talk about. I asked some questions. We had some questions from the audience, but maybe there are things that you also wanted to bring up in the context of this panel that you'd like to share. Wanted to make sure that there was space for that.
I would like to answer your question just a hair bit more about the youth. I am a parent of 4 who are high school and younger, and I mentor youth, and the kids are not okay, right? So I'm assuming y'all are over 20. But imagine being 15 with climate being all over the news. It is all over the news because it is real, but it's also been having to convince the people who are climate change deniers that this is real and it's happening and the evidence is gathering. But what if that's your world? And then what if COVID has created all these disconnections and systems of fear and given you no sense of future? Oh, it's just going to get worse. Oh, it's going to get better. No, it just got worse. No, it got worse. No, like just imagine the 15-year-olds of this world. They are not okay. And if we do not be accountable for collaborating and creating real change, and engaging them in the solution and what it is they need and how they could help and be agents in their own lives, we've got no future. And I would like to live to be a difficult old lady. So I need them, and I need them to be engaged, and I need them to not feel hopeless and part of the dispossessed, right? So that is who we are doing this for, is ourselves as old people, so that there is a future for our children, because engaging youth is like the point. Because we've had a lot of opportunity. We are in this room, right? We have had a lot of opportunity. So we want to make sure that all of the people who are without even a model for hope in their lives, right? That we have done the work.
I would even add, I think we're not doing this for, but also with, and we're running a project in Planet Texas right now that is with young people, looking at collapse narratives, looking at climate justice, and thinking about having them using the arts, poetry, theater, performance, visual art, some of those different kind of meaning making skills as a way for them to both process stories of climate justice collapse, both from the past, current, and I think the future. Thinking about counter storying, what are the other stories we want to tell? How do we tell them? Whose stories are told in this curriculum, whose stories are not? And then ideally, the idea is to have those young people build out modules that then they are teaching to teachers across the school district.
Yeah.
So that they're leading that change through their voice and their perspective on what like a project-based unit might look like that can be adapted, yes, in the standards of the Texas curriculum, but also sort of trying to innovate and change that through their lens and space. So we're early on it, but it's really aligned with those beliefs. Super important.
Do any of the other panelists want to add anything?
I'll just add that I think to solve these complex real world problems, we need this kind of engagement that Adam, you and your team are fostering in terms of an interdisciplinary approach. I really think that if we let only the scientists do science and the arts people do arts and the social scientists do social sciences, we're just creating corridors as opposed to open spaces. And so I want to applaud you and your whole team, Heidi, and everyone else, that the work is so important to bring in the multiple voices to really address these super complicated questions.
Thank you. I want to end with an observation that I was thinking as I was listening to Monica's poem. And both Monica and George, I really appreciate your willingness to share creative work with us. And that goes directly to the spirit of these projects, which really attempt to integrate those activities with the things that we think of as being research or science or academic. And one of the reasons I wanted to focus on storytelling, which has been a thread that has been woven throughout what we're talking about, is that you can tell people all you want about climate change or about various kinds of hazards or even about the past, but if they don't feel those things on a more visceral and emotional level, it doesn't connect. And what I thought was really interesting is the way that all of the panelists have been talking about and sharing things that were meant to inhabit other bodies and other spaces. So Monica, I was really struck by the way that you were trying to get into the head of that brown thrasher, what was it that was making that bird end up where it did? And that is an act of sort of projection and empathy. And I think that, George, what you were reading was the same kind of thing, to inhabit somebody else's or some other entity's shoes. And as an archaeologist, this is what I do all the time, right? I mean, we're always trying to do this. And it's, in some ways, it's an act of ego and a problem because you're projecting your own ideas into this other being, but it's also a way to try to understand a context that is very different from your own. And I think that being able to communicate that somehow to stakeholders is one of the key things, reaching both the communities that are affected and the communities that are making choices that affect frontline communities in a climate equity situation, right? The choice to go and gentrify a house on the east side of Austin. I think that having that chance to inhabit somebody else's space for a bit is really important. So I really appreciated the way that came together from all of the panelists, and I'm really grateful that you took the time with us today to speak. And I'm hoping that this is a conversation that will continue. And Ed, now that I know that you're at UTRGV, it's definitely going to continue because we have a whole collaboration focused on oral histories and old photographs and flooding in the valley and AI, and so there's lots of stuff that I hope will keep us talking. And
yeah, and I'll be engaging with their disaster studies program as well. So
perfect. No, with this, I'll fill you in, but there's lots of stuff. And I hope that we'll have a chance to keep talking too. And Jennifer is going to stick around and look at the VR futures exhibit. So there's a lot of discussion, I think, to happen about inhabiting virtual spaces as well as imaginative and interpersonal spaces. Thank you all again for a great panel and for attending. And thank you those of you who zoomed in, and everybody in the live studio audience. And please feel free to reach out and contact us. And I do want to point out that tomorrow there is an event that is a panel discussion with the City of Austin Sustainability to continue that engagement with the city. So please check out the other events if you're around Austin that we're holding this week. And we look forward to seeing some of you at events in the future. Thank you all.
Thanks for moderating, Adam.
Of course.